ever-changing world. From the NewsChannel 5 network, this is Issues of Faith.
Hello everyone, welcome to Issues of Faith. We're talking about something today that I think is so important. We're talking about following Jesus, or following our faith in this polarized world. The world is no doubt polarized, and what do people of faith, what should our response be? How should we react and deal within that polarization? And I'm very happy to have with us Dr. Paul Lim, Vanderbilt Professor. Thank you for being here.
Sure.
You recently spoke at a church about this, and I'm just fascinated by it. There's no doubt, would you agree, that we're polarized right now? Mm-hmm. I mean, what's your assessment of where we are right now?
Sure. I think, societies have always been polarized in some ways, but it's a matter of spectrum and scope. And I think right now, in our American political and religious climate, it seems more divided than before, and people have different opinions about why that is. And I think sometimes the unfortunate marriage between politics and religion in the American context has brought this problem even more intensely to be felt among all people. So, talk about polarization. I was in Bulgaria not too long ago giving lectures, and there people are polarized, right? And it's true in Hungary with some of the governmental kind of leaders, and same thing in Turkey. And so Britain, for example, with the whole context of Brexit, is also kind of pulling different kind of medial segments further and further apart. So it seems like that sort of polarization is everywhere with us. But here in America, I think in the last 10, 15 years, we have experienced more of it. Some people attribute that to global issues of terror. Others talk about pluralism. Others talk about immigration. And all of that have found their ways onto our soil and shores. So I think we have to deal with that in the way that we know best. And
the concern that I sometimes have is that this polarization, our political polarization, is pushing people away from the church.
Yes.
As one side or both sides stake a claim on this or that, that this polarization has an impact on the church.
Sure.
And maybe not a good one.
Right.
And I guess my question would be, so how should the church respond? Do you think it is impacting views of the church, and what should the church be doing in this polarized time?
Right. I think in terms of some of the surveys and studies that have been done recently on the young people, as to why they're leaving the church, it seems that they feel that the Christian faith, for example, is primarily affiliated with a certain political party, right? In this case, more often than not, the Republican Party, and all the culture war pieces that went along with that. And I do think that it's important for people to recognize that maybe Christianity is about Christ, not about the donkeys or elephants, or Republicans or Democrats, because I think, we can try to affix blame on one particular party, but at the same time, I think both parties in different moments in American history have burdens of blame, right? So, but when you think about the fact that many of the young people want more authentic faith, they want something to do with Jesus of first century, as well as someone who may be alive today. And so if you take the historic Christian faith seriously, that means that you do believe that Jesus is alive today. He's not some kind of figment of your imagination, or some kind of historical figure that lived then and there but not anymore. So then the question becomes, if you're a follower of Christ, what kind of Christ is he? Who is he, and why does he matter today? So one of my favorite biblical texts actually is Hebrews chapter 13, following Jesus outside the city gate. The writer of Hebrews says, you know what? We are now living in a very intensely persecuted time. It is really causing us to think about what it is that we believe, who it is that we follow. And then the writer in chapter 13 says, just as he suffered outside the city gate, in the same way, we should go to Christ outside the camp, bearing the disgrace he bore. And then he said, we do not have a city we don't have an enduring city here, but we are looking for the one that is to come. So it seems to me a couple of things may have been amiss in our intense political debates about the right way to worship and right way to believe. And because sometimes we feel as if so long as we have a Christian in the White House, then the deal's over. We won the battle. But I don't think that's the case, because Caesar, as far as we know in the first century Roman context, was not a follower of Christ. And Christ was not a power broker. He was, first of all, a refugee, right? When he was born, shortly after his birth, Herod the emperor wanted to kill him, murder him. Therefore, his parents took off with the baby and they lived in Egypt for a while. That means in God's wonderful and inscrutable plan, God had God's own son, Jesus, live abroad, live as a refugee. Now, if God does not make mistakes, then why did God do that? What's the point? What's the lesson there? So it seems to me that when we look at that Jesus who lived as a refugee, who did not have any power politically or culturally or socioeconomically, he was part of the downtrodden community, he was part of the marginal community. Then when we think about that Jesus in the context of whether you're Republican or Democrat or evangelical or progressive Christian, we all need to do some rethinking about our what we will call Christology. Who is Christ and why does he matter for us today?
And Christ, take it further, was then very radical.
Sure, absolutely.
I mean, he was, and that's where we get into some of the back and forth.
Yes.
Some would say he was political,
Yep.
he was radical, and he was challenging the authorities of the day.
Yes.
And so it's I think it's dangerous for Christians to say, okay, we should just stay out of politics, but then at the same time I think it's dangerous when Christians take a political party maybe too much. And so I think when you look at what Christ was, that he was radical, and that he was out there fighting these fights, how does that translate, do you think, into today?
Yeah, sure. So when I gave these talks at Woodmont Christian Church, I used the word radical in the most definitional way, meaning that radical means having to do with the roots. Back to the roots. So radix, R-A-D-I-X, means roots. So the radical, Jesus the radical, means someone who really wanted to go back to the roots of loving and worshiping Yahweh, right? God of Israel. So when I say radical, that means someone who was neither right nor left in a way. Jesus had his own agenda, and that was not, when Jesus asked this question, right? Should we pay tax to Caesar, right? And then it says, well, give unto Caesar that which is Caesar's and give unto God that which is God's. So I do think that he wasn't trying to be kind of equivocating, but he was trying to cut through the Gordian knot and get to the heart of the matter. I think we tend to make the mistake of, I think you're right, complete abdication from political process is a problem, but also to really believe that by having the right person in the office, whether it is local or state or at the federal level, and believe that by having the right person in the office, we will win whatever the political battle or religious war, that's a problem. Because, for example, Martin Luther, a 16th century German reformer, says something like this, that he would rather have a Turk who's a good governor than a Christian prince who's going to be basically a selfish kind of despot. And I think it does raise some very interesting issues for us. What is governance, and does religion have anything to do with governance of, political entities? And I do think that religions do have some things to say about that, ethical kind of mandates, and how we ought to treat one another as creatures who are made in the image of God, and so on and so forth. And because we have to deliberate and decide on things, politics is inevitable. But to really marry politics with religion is where the problems arise, it seems to me.
And how, in our culture now, do we separate it? I guess it seems to me that it is so divisive right now.
Yes.
And you can look at other times in our history where we've seen real great division. But we're so divided right now. Can we separate it? Should it be something churches strive to do? And where do we go right now? When you look at what we are and how divided we are, what should we be striving to do, and what is realistic?
Yeah, so let's start with something that is really kind of, at one level, quite easy to do, but we don't often do it, and that is to have a meal, or whether breakfast, lunch, or dinner, or have a drink with a person who doesn't share your political or religious views, right? I mean, because now we can talk high theory all we want, but at the end of the day, it is, who we have dinners with that tells us a lot about whose company we keep and who our friends are, right? And I was talking to some colleagues this morning at Vanderbilt about interfaith kind of endeavors and how Christians in our globalized context ought to actually know people of other faith traditions, even if it means that you don't embrace and become that particular devotee of whether Hinduism, Buddhism, or Judaism, or Islam. But it is not possible for us to, unless you really kind of get yourself isolated in your cultural and religious enclave, it is really imperative for us to know more about, become more culturally competent, right? And to be more globally aware, because Nashville has become a really, its city, very popular spot for people not just from different parts of the US, but from different parts of the world, whether you're from the Kurdistan area or different parts of the world. So it seems that even in Nashville, we have to become more aware of what other people believe, and to really kind of extend that arm of hospitality. In the same chapter, Hebrews 13, the writer says, you know, exercise hospitality to strangers. And the Greek word here, there, I mean, I don't mean to sound all that kind of New Testament Greekish, but the word there is the antonym or the opposite of what has become very popular in our cultural vocabulary, xenophobia. Fear of the stranger. The writer of Hebrews says, you know, you should exercise a love of the stranger. The word is philoxenia, love of the stranger. And so I think it is very important, whatever religious or political persuasions you may have, to really be open to the possibility of having a meal with or having a conversation with somebody with whom you may not agree. Because I think as a result of the polarization, two things have occurred among others. One is your increasing conviction that you and you alone are right. Right? So we got fundamentalists on both sides of the divide. Lefty fundamentalists, righty fundamentalists. And when I talk to these, because they're my friends, when I talk to them, they seem pretty dang convinced that they are right and the other absolutely wrong. That means one of the things that gets chucked out the window is that the sort of epistemic and ethical humility that I actually need to learn until I come home, right? I actually need to be learning as much as I can about myself and the other and the Savior. And it is encounter of the other that I learn more about myself and my God. So I think that whole aspect of, you know, recognizing that I'm in the lifelong learning process, and as I actually recognize that I don't know everything, that means I'm going to be more open to revising my views and entertaining and inviting someone who may not share my views, because so often we have to ask ourselves this question: what are you really afraid of? So let's say I don't want to hang out with group X. What is my fear? My fear may be if I hang out with that person or that group a lot, I may be changed. Right? We're afraid. I mean, so for example, culinary-wise, because I think what we put into our mouths as part of our meals tells us a lot about how adventurous you are or how, you know, averse we are from trying things. And think about a lot of different foods that are now making their ways into Nashville, right? I mean, I'm a big ramen guy, right? And there's a good ramen place not far from here. Like, I don't think we could have thought about that 30 years ago, 40 years ago, but now, so people are willing to try things into their mouths, and that means that you're at least willing to give it a go. And I think what you eat and with whom you eat tells me a lot. And that is both from the biblical culture as well as a lot of cultures around. I mean, think about who you have at your house for dinner or with whom you have meals at restaurants. That tells me a lot about what kind of persons you like to keep as your friends and company. And I do think that in our age of kind of polarization, we need to take that one meaningful yet small step, and yet not insignificant step of saying, I want to have a meal with that person. I want to actually get to know them a little bit, because
get beyond the D and the R.
Yes.
That is.
Yes.
It's pretty easy to ascertain with just a few questions if that's what you care about. You can figure out, okay, there's a he's on my side or he's not on my side or whatever.
Right.
But get beyond that. And, and we're going to take a break. But you have a video that's on YouTube that's had over 1 million hits.
Right.
Which is remarkable. And it kind of gets past. It's more about the personal.
Right.
And I think that's what you're talking about.
Right.
Is we need to get past the 2 or 3 questions that identifies somebody as, oh, they're in this camp or that camp, and get to know them on a bigger level, on a more spiritual level.
Sure.
All right, we'll take a break. We'll come back, talk about that, be back right after this.